at the front, so please do go and have a look at them. For your listening pleasure, you've got the Silent Seminar headphones. We do have alternative languages which have gone, I think it was Spanish, French and German. If you do need that, go see Meg in the blue shirt at the back and you can swap them around. There should be closed captions as well on this side of the screen. Again, I said in the first session, it feels like an oxygen mask will come down in an emergency if you need it. But also, if you have any questions at any point, scan the QR code on the screen over there. I think it might come up there too. And you can ask your Q&A straight into the panel and they'll bring them up. So without further ado, let me introduce you to Terreson, Director of Account Management at Stova, and take it away.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Well, welcome everyone to today's session. We're really excited to be here. As they mentioned, my name's Terreson. I'm the Director of Account Management at Stova. And today we are joined by Rhys Morgan with JP Morgan. He heads up the MarTech in EMEA, and Miguel Neves. All right, we practiced this and I already messed it up. But thank you, gentlemen, for joining us. We're really excited about the discussion here today. And before we get started, I do want to open it up to the audience to better understand your knowledge around data and how it relates to events. So we're going to do a little bit of an interactive poll here, and we'll have a scale from 1 to 5. So 1 being you know nothing about event data, 5 being you're an event data expert. So with a raise of hands, who here would consider themselves a 1? Perfect. All right. 2 means you know a little bit about event data. We have a bunch of experts. Okay, all right, 1, 2. 3 means you have an intermediate knowledge of event data. All right. 4, you're an advanced event data, or not expert, but you're advanced. 4, and then lastly 5, any experts in the audience? All right, Julian Ward, he's an expert. Okay, all right, perfect, well thank you. All right, we're gonna go ahead and get started. And the first question I have here is, how has the adoption of data-driven decision-making transformed the landscape of event planning and management in recent years? Miguel?
Me first?
Yeah.
Hey everybody, welcome, good morning. I think recent years we need to talk about the pandemic, we need to talk about virtual events, and we need to talk about how that triggered a big focus on data. I think there's a wealth of data that comes from events. I think when it comes to virtual events, it's easier to capture some of that data. There's the activation. Anytime somebody clicks on something, views something, you can measure that. And I think that's really valuable. And I think towards sort of the latter part of the kind of virtual event peak, planners started to get very good at understanding what that data means. Dwell time, clicks, leads, whatever it is that you're kind of trying to measure. And so I think now it's a time where we're trying to translate that to in-person events, and I think there's a lot of options on how to do that, how to capture that data. It's not as easy, it's not as obvious that there's all this data captured all the time, so you have to find different ways of doing that. But I think that's been a big change, and now we're trying to figure that out, and we know that it's valuable, particularly now also with things like cookies going away and a lot of data restrictions. It's even more valuable and more kind of, we need to figure out how to capture that data. So there's a lot of questions. I think there's a lot of energy around data, and there's a lot of getting to the next level. I think we'd like to kind of push organizers to kind of get to that next level of data collection and what to do with the data as well.
Absolutely. Rhys, do you have anything to add there?
Yeah, I think when it comes to leveraging event data, we've really seen how it can level up our events. So this starts right from marketing and promotion, making sure we're able to invite the right people through the right channel and at the right time. And you can only do that if you can back that decision making with data. And then when it comes to events itself, we're able to now leverage data to create much more personalized, engaging experiences by learning people's preferences and interests. And so that's really helped create much more attendee engagement, and hopefully you're seeing some of that here at the types of event today. I think other uses of data that we're starting to see that's leveling up the experience is around automation, so freeing up event planners to focus on things that are really important, also optimizing the resources that we have and using those in the right way. And finally, I would also say that we're also able to use data to improve events year on year using things like predictive analytics to say, actually, what are the themes and trends that were this year that we can leverage in future events.
In what ways does data-driven decision-making contribute to the overall success and effectiveness of events?
So I think data is this nice buzzword. And we could talk about data for the event geeks in the audience. We could talk about data all day, and that's great. But ultimately, we want to make our events better. That's what this is all about. So I think the way data contributes is that it enables us to, first of all, market our events better. That to kind of attract people, attract exhibitors, etc. It enables us to design events better. And it enables us ultimately just to create better events. That's what it's about, right? And I think it's easy to lose track of that sometimes. If you get too stuck on the way of doing that, it's like, what are we actually getting out of this data? How are we making our next event better? If we can do that, then it's a worthwhile pursuit.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's all about elevating the epic, as we're saying at Stova. Rhys, anything from your side?
I think Miguel's right. It covers every dimension and every person and touch point of an event. So right from the planning through to the engagement side of the event, and then post-event and looking at how we can optimize going forward. So data is there right across the spectrum. It's enhancing the event planner's experience, and it's enhancing the engagement that we get from attendees.
Absolutely. All right, well, let's head over into the role of technology in collecting, analyzing, and visualizing the event data. How can you explain the significance of real-time data collection and its impact on decision-making during an event?
I can maybe take that one to start. So I think when it comes to real-time data, kind of ways we can leverage it and the importance of it, one would be around trouble resolution. So it's imperative that we can understand if there are issues going on at certain stands or at certain exhibits, so we can react dynamically to those. It might be technical issues where an event planner can get involved and to make adjustments real time. Secondly, we can look at the engagement that we're seeing. So have we got a stand or an event that's over or undersubscribed? And if so, do we need to delay that event? Do we need to bring in seat fillers, etc.? So with data, we can look at that attendee information and kind of dynamically respond. And then thirdly, I would say we can also look at, from a personalization perspective, real time, the choices you're making during an event, we can use that to personalize the experience and create kind of a unique, bespoke experience for you for that particular event.
Is data also important in the pre-event planning and post-event follow-up?
Absolutely. I think yes is the simple answer. I think it's crucial because, look, you want to collect all that data after the event, during the event if you can, or after the event. Surveys are still great ways to collect data, right? And unfortunately, not everybody replies to them, but I think they're really useful. But I think the more you can have that visualization of data, the more you can make that data make sense to you. Look, I love a good spreadsheet, right? Who loves a good spreadsheet in the audience? They're great. But, if you get a spreadsheet full of data, it takes you a while to kind of understand what you're looking at, right? If you can decide in advance what you're looking at, and if you can have some kind of dashboard, some kind of visualization where you're seeing, hey, there's a leaderboard here, or there's a red light if this happens, or something happens, then that data is making sense to you. And then you can make decisions in real time, like we were just saying, or even if it's just planning decisions, it's still better. I mean, the number of times that I know of organizations that get sort of data dumps from their events, and then they actually end up not doing anything with them because the decisions have already been made about the next event, and it's too late to go back, and you sort of end up on this cycle of like, okay, this is great data, but we're never going to have the resources to get to them. And that's such a waste, right? You need
Absolutely.
to build that up before you get the data so that when you get it, it sort of goes, this is what I was looking for. You have your list of speakers at your events, for example. I'm sure when you get the data and you go, we thought that was really going to be a popular session, but it wasn't. You need to know that before you start inviting speakers for your next event, right? That's the kind of thing that I think is really important, that it needs to pop out of the screen. It can't be a 16-page spreadsheet that you go, yeah, it's in here somewhere.
Yeah, well, that's actually a great segue into the next subject, which is really some real-world examples around showcasing successful data-driven event decisions. So do you have any examples, Miguel?
Look, I think some of the examples that I was thinking of, on the app side, for example, I'm a really big fan of event apps that are kind of give you information live. So I don't know if you saw, I mean, some events apps do this all the time now, but at, I think South by Southwest, I think it was like 2021, one of the event apps did this thing where it would give you how busy a session was. So there was maybe, I don't know, 20 sessions happening at the same time. So you could tell how busy that room was. You know, and at the time that was kind of like a COVID thing. Like, I don't want to go to a room that's too full of people. But now it's like, that's actually really useful information. If you're walking around a big show and you're like, hey, that session is packed and I'm not going to be able to get in. Okay, I don't have to walk for 500 meters to that show. Or the organizers can go, hey, let's put up a screen outside that room to have some overflow so people can watch that. I think that kind of stuff is really, really useful and really powerful, you know, and it's not just about number crunching. It's like, hey, can we make this a better event for people that are here right now? But you need to be prepared, right? You need to know that you're going to get that data, and you need to kind of set that up in advance. You have
yeah, I think a couple of examples I could give within JP Morgan where we're using event data to improve our experience over time. One is around registration experience. No one likes registering. It's a pain, it's laborious, and it's a big cause for a drop-off for us in terms of attendees coming to our events. So we've spent a lot of time analysing the data of how people are interacting with the registration process, where are the friction points and how we can improve it. And so we've been really focused on creating frictionless registration experiences to make it as optimal as possible and as simple as efficient as possible to people to register. And that includes events where we might have travel and hotel incorporated as well. We want to make sure that that's kind of seamless and integrated into that whole process. And that also helps the event planners as well, because we've built kind of touch points and integration so that all of that data is feeding through to our hoteliers and our travel providers, so that there isn't kind of manual touch points going on there as well. And then the other piece, which we touched on right at the start, is about how we can make sure we're inviting the right people to future events. So we harness all of the data that we're getting around engagement, attendance to our events, look at different themes around who's the right person to invite to future events as well. And that's really helped us kind of make sure we're mapping the right people to the right events going forward.
Is there anything that hasn't worked or that's fallen flat for you?
I'll let Rhys think about that one. I know. So I used to work for IMEX, and this is a while back. But I think when the first IMEX America show opened, this is 2012, we used smart badges, and that captured, kind of through beacons, it captured data all across the show floor of where everybody was. The problem was that it came back, the data came back, and it came back in this 35 megabytes of spreadsheet of all these data points of all the show floor, and nobody in the company had any idea how to use that data. It was like, coordinates from a show floor, like thousands and thousands. And so it was like, great, we have all this data, and we were able to do absolutely zero with it. So that was definitely something that didn't work. And it goes back to that point of, okay, once you know what you're going to get, how are you going to use it? And maybe if you don't know how to use it, then don't get it in the first place.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. We've experienced that as well.
Yeah, my example is very similar. It is true without having the right dashboards and knowing what your KPIs are. It's very challenging. And I think historically we've come from a similar background where we've taken these data dumps of spreadsheets, and it's been kind of looking for themes and trying to find correlations. And as we're getting more advanced with data analytics tools, visualizations, and AI, which I'm sure there'll be some questions around AI, it's become more around actually less about digging for data, but actually surfacing up the themes and correlations as well, and bringing those insights in front of the planners and your marketing teams.
Yeah, I think tools are going to be in.
Kira.
Oh, sorry guys. Thanks. I think tools are really important, and so understanding what tools and platforms are successful for data collection and whatnot. And so, in terms of the types of technologies you all are using, what are commonly used for collecting event data, and how do they streamline the data collection process for event organizers?
Okay, there's quite a few of them, so I'll try and list off the ones I can remember. So I think key is obviously your event management platform, and in particular I'd start off with your registration process. So making sure that is streamlined. I talked about before about how you want to kind of automate as much of that capture as possible, so you're not having manual touch points. I think also You're looking at when you're at events, you're looking at your badging technology. We've obviously all got our QR codes here, so being able to capture through sensors or through NFC or QR codes, like I said, to understand which exhibitors and which exhibitions you've been to as well. We talked a little bit before about capturing feedback through surveys and Q&A. It can be a pain, but it's still actually a really important touch point, and if you can marry that up with your particular attendees, that's great in terms of lead generation and follow-up as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think about it as pre, during, and post, right? So pre is registration, during is tracking, whether it's scanning, beacons, how can you tell what's happening from a data perspective on the show? And then post is the surveys. I think that's the basic one. I mean, you can get some. So, for example, I know at IMEX, I don't work for IMEX anymore, but that's one of my reference points, right? At IMEX, they've used the Zenus AI facial, not recognition, but facial analysis system. So that's pretty advanced. The idea is that there's a camera that captures people's emotions in the room. So if there was a camera set up here, they could figure out who was smiling, who was not smiling, and kind of figure out, hey, and if you do that across a number of sessions, you can figure out, hey, that session had a lot more smiles than the other sessions, so you can kind of say that that was a more popular or that it was a more engaging session. I think they're really interesting data points. I'm not 100% sure how much you could do with that. Again, it's like thinking, what are you going to do with that? But I guess in terms of speaker selection, which is something that you talked about, it could be useful, right? But I don't know, sometimes a really serious data-driven session is actually really popular in a survey, but you might not get a lot of smiles during a session, right? So I don't know how much of that correlates directly between how good a session was and how smiley everybody was.
Yeah.
The other area I omitted to mention is that we do use is around social media monitoring as well. So a big event like this, we'll be looking for shares or any sort of sentiment analysis as well, and kind of trying to pair that up with what the engagement might be at that particular event.
Yeah. Well, I guess are there event or industry specific tools that you use at JPMC?
Without naming specific names, we obviously have an event management platform which is core to our MarTech stack. So I think also when we talk about technology, I think historically, and this is true within JP Morgan as well, I'm sure at a number of other businesses, is that event management was kind of not necessarily embedded within the whole marketing ecosystem. Certainly for me now as head of MarTech in EMEA, it's a key part of our ecosystem, and it's embedded right into, it's integrated with our CRM platforms, also with our marketing automation. So it's all interlinked, and this is really an important point in terms of data as well. It's not useful if it's kind of kept in that silo. It has limited use anyway. So I think an event management platform is core. Obviously, you need your polling and your survey capabilities, data visualization, and having sort of the data analytics dashboard, so you can actually make sense of this data and have kind of what we found with data analytics is it's really important you've got the right view for the right person as well. So an event planner might be looking for one thing, whereas if you're presenting to your senior marketing team, it might be other metrics you need to pull up. So being able to tailor that for the right audience as well is key.
Yeah, dashboarding is key because you want to be able to see it just at a quick high level and then be able to drill down for the folks who need to be more in the weeds. Miguel, are there any specific industry data collection tools that you feel are key to success?
Okay, without naming any names, default.
Yeah, well, no
we
names.
Can name.
Right.
No names. Okay. Name them. Interesting. Well, one interesting tool that I was just talking to a gentleman earlier is a survey tool that does a big survey tool that does a lot of kind of exhibition surveys, and where I think they have a really interesting advantage is that they have a benchmark. So if you're running a trade show and you want to know, what's the normal dwell time at a booth, what's the normal engagement for somebody at a trade show, etc. They have information from thousands of trade shows, so you can kind of tell, hey, my event's doing well or it's not. And they can also do that for different segments, different industries, financial, etc. And so I think more than a tool, having that benchmark can be incredibly valuable, because you have no idea, especially if you're only doing a show in one area, how good is your show compared to other shows? It's very hard to know that as an attendee. You can show up at other events, but you're not really going to know that off the bat. So that ability to benchmark data, I think, is really valuable, and I think I'd like to see that in more areas, but happy to share the name if you come and chat afterwards.
Sure. What challenges and concerns are related to data privacy and security? Loaded question.
I mean, privacy is probably the less sexy part of event management and data, but it's for us at JP Morgan and across events as a whole, data privacy is absolutely paramount. I mean, when you're talking about events, you're talking about personal information, so it is critical. So we take our standards around this absolute to the highest standard. So if I can think of some of the basic things, again, I come from a technology background, so forgive me. We would expect all our platforms to offer encryption, both in transit and in rest. So any platforms you're using, that is just a given. You need to make sure that the people who have access to the data are permissioned correctly. So we have the concept of least privilege, so meaning only give the permissions that they need. Typically, we'll strengthen that up with things like multi-factor authentication to make sure that it's as strong as possible. And then we have other things such as monitoring tools to make sure real time, if there are any breaches, what does that mean? Obviously, as I mentioned, because this data is encrypted, ideally, if someone did get access to this PI, it would be useless to them. But of course, all of this kind of stuff around securing data is momentary, right? It has to be a cyclical process. So we will have constant monitoring, constant security reviews, because vulnerabilities, new weaknesses are coming all the time. And so for JP Morgan, we're doing kind of at a minimum annual kind of surveys around our how strong our security standards are on our event platforms.
I think at a kind of bigger picture thing, data is incredibly important for running events well, particularly as we're heading towards this idea of having really personalized events. If we can personalize journeys for people at an event, it really makes them feel special. It makes them feel great. The problem with that is you need to collect the data to be able to personalize. And a lot of the data that we collect around events is very sensitive information. Anything that can identify people is sensitive, right? That personally identifiable information. And so I think it's really important to have tools that you trust, tools that are integrated in the right way, so that you can capture that data, probably at registration, and make sure that it's useful for you at the point where you need it, and it's encrypted until it gets to that point. Of course, there's humans involved, right? So there's always ways for that data to get in the wrong hands or to be misused, but if you can keep that data encrypted as far as you can until you need it, then that's the ideal scenario. I mean, we wrote about something recently, which is, I think, the My Health, My Data Act that's coming out in the States, and that's a big thing because even things like dietary restrictions, if you have a dietary restriction, that's actually personally identifiable information. Like, they can't figure out who you are from that, but that actually can be used against you. And I think there was a case of data around kosher meals. So unfortunately, we're in a situation where there's a war going on, and anybody who orders a kosher meal is going to be Jewish, and so there's a risk there. And if that data goes into the wrong hands or it's divulged in the wrong way, then that can be really dangerous. And so we're dealing with quite a dangerous topic here.
I think another way that can be handled as well is around anonymizing the data or obfuscating it where you can. So if it's not required to know, this is Miguel, then absolutely anonymize the data at every touch point you can.
That's very interesting. I didn't even think about that. So we've spoken a little bit about AI and what that all means, and so I wanted to shift gears and talk a little bit about that. So how do advancements in machine learning and artificial intelligence contribute to the efficiency and accuracy of event data analysis?
How long have we got? This is AI. We've opened up the AI Pandora's box. Yes.
Yeah.
AI is such an interesting topic. Can I just get a show of hands? Who here is using AI or has experimented like ChatGPT and all that kind of stuff? Okay. Who's used it in a professional scenario? So for your job? Okay, so that's about half of the people that put up their hands before. Okay, that's always interesting. So one of the most, I do a lot of research and writing about AI, and there's a lot of really fascinating tools, particularly like in the content generation area, and then there's the repurposing of videos, that sort of area. Those are the two areas that I'm seeing a lot of energy around the event space. But my favorite is actually with data, right? When you can throw multiple different data sources of what we call dirty data, spreadsheets that aren't necessarily normalized, they don't necessarily have the same headers, all that kind of stuff. If you can throw that at AI, and it can make sense of that data and give you back useful information, and even better, help you organize that data, or even better, tell you what questions you should be asking, tell you what you should be looking for, which comes from that sort of benchmarking, because AI has that sort of like what type of questions are normally asked in MarTech essentially. That's super useful, because as an event organizer, you don't necessarily know all the questions you can get, all the answers you can get from your data. And if AI can help you figure out what you should be asking, then I think that's a great way to use AI. And it's not like a way where it's like, oh, is AI telling the truth or is it hallucinating? Doesn't matter. If it's giving you an idea of what you can look for in your data and then you can find it, then I think that's super useful.
What other emerging trends will impact event data and success?
Gosh. I think AI is going to keep us busy for the next few years, to be honest. I mean, there's a few technologies that we already see events that maybe haven't penetrated yet that I still think have big potential. I think you talked about face recognition before. I think that's still at the cusp of really taking off. I'd like to see more usage of AR and VR, and again, coupled with AI, I think that's going to be a big draw. I think we just need to figure out how to use those more effectively and engage folks. And the other piece I would say that where I think is going to be key in terms of data is around sustainability, particularly in EMEA, but hopefully more so globally as well. I think we're going to be paying much more attention around the green credentials around events, using data to measure our carbon footprint and to make kind of improvements event on event as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, because I think 1st of January, at least in the EU, there's a big sustainability regulation that's coming in, and a lot of suppliers are going to have to be certified, etc. And the only way you're going to be able to do that and run events in the EU is by having data about the things that are being measured. So it's not just about how many people showed up, but actually figuring out where they came from, how did you mitigate those, that carbon footprint, etc. And that's all down to data. If you don't have the data, you can't prove that you did anything about it.
Yes, that's in just being here, everyone's talking about CO2 emissions and how to reduce that footprint. So, well, let's take a look at best practices for setting up data-driven processes within the event management workflow. How can event planners identify and define relevant key performance indicators to guide the establishment of effective data-driven processes?
So maybe I can give a little bit of insight to some of the processes we go through in this space as well. So I think the first thing is to actually really sit down and identify what your objectives are. So is it around attendee engagement? Is it overall attendance? What is it you're looking to achieve from your events? That's first and foremost. You can't really have any KPIs unless you know what you're trying to achieve. Once you have your objective, you can then start to figure out, okay, what is the success factor for this objective? So if we look at attendee engagement or feedback, it might be overall survey scores, percentage, or it might be percentage positive. Then you've got to look at, once I know the measures, how am I going to measure that? Have I got the right tools and technologies and platforms in place to be able to capture that data in the first place? You also need to know what are your benchmarks, and they've got to be realistic and relevant to your KPIs as well. Finally, once you've measured it, and we talked about this before, you're going to have some data, you've got to know what to do with it. So you need to have the right platforms, and this is again where AI can help surface some of those insights, so you can actually measure against what your original KPIs and objectives were. And finally, you need to actually have a concrete action plan behind that. There's no point in kind of coming up with these insights but not having any kind of resolution or follow through. So I think, and this is where it becomes cyclical, because once you've figured out those actions and you've put in place resources, time, people, things change. So you need to continually measure that and go back through that loop again, so you can make year-on-year improvements.
Yeah, I was going to say, and once you get it down pat, you have to switch gears because something else has changed and you're going to have to revisit what that strategy is. So, Miguel, anything to add on this topic?
I was just going to touch on that resources point. I think that's really important. The platforms, absolutely, but putting in time, setting up, your meetings to discuss that in advance so that you know that you're going to use that data. And I can't stress that enough. The amount of times that doesn't happen is it's dangerous.
All right. right. Switching gears once more, I suppose, what are the strategies for translating data insights into actionable improvements for events? How do you establish a systemic approach for continuous improvement based on insights gained from data-driven processes in event management?
Well, I think you mentioned it already, the cyclical kind of process.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's super important. I think it's come somewhat natural with event planners to kind of have a cyclical nature to planning, but that, like, how do you improve the cycle? That's the bit that's important, that's in there, and you sort of plan for changes. And it's hard to do, right? Because when we're planners, we want everything to be at a certain time frame. There's deadlines and there's things that just can't happen, but that change has to be part of those deadlines, and then it's going to impact things, further down the stream. So it's really important to put that in there and plan ahead to have that, so that the actions actually make sense.
Rhys, do you have any recommendations on how you refine that process, or how do you do that at JP Morgan?
So, yeah, I think it's also important you're really honest with yourself as well. There's no point going through this process and coming out with actions if you're then going to employ the things in your events that you've just done before without really putting that emphasis on the data to say, actually, no, this didn't work. I was in an event last week and there was a comment made about event planners without data is just an event planner with an opinion. So it's absolutely important that you're using this data to make improvements incrementally. I think I really touched on in terms of overall process there. I think it's really important that once you've kind of identified and analyzed that data, you need to prioritize what are the big wins you can make out of that data in terms of improvements going forward.
Perfect. Well, we've breezed through all of our questions here today, so I do want to kick it over to Q&A.
There's 3 questions.
There's 3 questions.
Do you want me to read them out?
Sure. I was going to pull up my app.
All right.
You read them.
What do you think is the most impactful factor in encouraging data-driven decision-making? Leads a little bit from what you're saying.
Yeah, I think important factor. I mean, again, it really depends on your own objectives around events. What are you actually looking to get out of it? ROI is clearly going to be something that we're all thinking about, but it can also be massively complicated to kind of analyze that. If I think in our private bank line of business, sometimes when we think about ROI and nurturing our leads, it's a multi-year journey. And so it actually becomes really hard to attribute back some of that ROI. So it is still possible, but that's absolutely a factor when we're determining kind of the importance of data. Again, like I said, it could be the engagement factor from your attendees. It might be touch points. It might be lead generation. So again, it depends on the type of event and the objectives that you set for that event.
So let me ask you something, if you don't mind. One of the things that I've thought about a lot is when you have data, a lot of times we have event data, right? If it's dwell time, it's lead numbers, whatever it is. How important is it to then translate that to language that your C-level understands? Because you can give them dwell times and clicks and whatever, but that's event data, right? You need to translate that to revenue or opportunities or savings, right? And how important is that? And do you do that? Is that part of kind of your role?
Yeah, absolutely. It is, particularly as a technologist, half of my role is actually talking in a language people can understand. So it is making sure you're presenting the data in a medium that's appropriate to who's interpreting it. I think one of the things we do at JP Morgan is we set our stall at the start of the year and we build OKRs. So everything we do across marketing and events has to be aligned to those OKRs, so those objectives and key results. So when you talk about how we're presenting, we're always trying to map back to that. So are we saving X number of hours of an event planner's time, in which case we can attribute cost savings around that? Or are we actually looking at kind of employee engagement scores increasing? Again, these are all aligned back to the OKRs, which ultimately are coming from those senior management folks.
If you're not speaking in the language of OKRs, they're not listening, right?
All right. If friction-free registration is coming, what impact will that have on badge scanning for exhibitors and the data we receive?
Interesting. I'd like to... Is the person that asked that question still here? Could we maybe get some clarification? Because I find that one a little cryptic. No? Friction-free registration. But I think, as registration gets more and more friction-free, And I think what the question is asking is, are people going to bother scanning people, right? Is that going to kind of disappear, and how do we make that still happen? Is that the question? No? Nobody's saying that they asked the question. Let's assume it is. I think that's kind of interesting. I don't know if one thing really impacts the other. I do think that sometimes it's important for us to be clear about what happens at each point. And I think event organizers are kind of guilty of not doing that as well. You know, like, okay, the data that's collected at registration, where does that go to? Who's using that? And yes, you know, it's probably written in the terms and conditions, but after the 18-page of terms and conditions, you know, there's not a lot of people that actually go through those, right? It's kind of understanding that. And then when your badge is scanned at a booth, how does that work, right? Like, what are you doing? Or if you're scanned when you come into an education session, who gets that data? And I think that's something that we probably should be better at and should be more open about, because it does become a bit of an issue, like especially if you have some really high net worth individuals or somebody walking around. It's like they want to know where their data is ending up, right?
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing across the board, a lot of our clients are sharing the need to have a seamless registration process, an easy, simple, let's collect some initial data and then maybe bring them back closer to the event and whatnot. And so when you're talking about friction-free, in my mind, I think seamless, just easy, simple, let's get the key details.
Does that work? Because I've been having that discussion a lot, and I think a lot of registration experts are kind of saying, I'm not going to risk it.
Yeah.
Because registration is that one point when we collect data. If then I need something critical, I need to bring them back, I'm always going to get drop-off. Are people really doing that?
We're seeing it, yeah. I mean, I think it depends, right? It's going to depend on the event, who the attendees are, but it's more about all of that pre-event engagement and making sure that you're continuing to engage with the attendee ahead of the event to get them excited and ramp and whatnot.
Yeah, and I think about some of our events that are very targeted, where we know the clients we're inviting, right? They're in our CRM platform. There's nothing more for being frustrated than being sent an invite, clicking on the registration, having to fill in your registration details again for a company that you've been to an event multiple times. So for us, it's absolutely paramount. If we already know the information we need about that client, all we want to know is, are you attending? And maybe there might be some additional touch points. Then we should ask for just the information we need. So we need our systems to be smart enough. We've got events where we can do single touch registration. So you get an invite, you just say, yes, I'm coming, done. So absolutely, it depends on the audience.
As an exhibitor, how can we work with the event organizers to make sure the data we receive is quality data?
You can't. Well, you can. I think ultimately, we need to think about it this as a partnership. I mean, I was just talking to one of the exhibitors here, and they do a lot of exhibitor marketing. So from their perspective is, hey, if you're exhibiting at a show, you're a partner with the organizer, and you should be inviting your people that you think would be interested to meet. And if everybody does that, then it's a bigger show and you contribute to growing a bigger show. And I think that's a really healthy approach, but it needs to come from a perspective of partnering with the shows. I think some companies go to shows and they're like, I'm paying you money, you go find people for me to have for leads. You go find my leads. And I think if everybody has that approach, shows will die. Because if you trust the organizer to build a list, or even worse, go buy a list and then kind of invite people to a show, shows are going to die like that. So as long as it comes from that partnership point of view, I think that makes sense. And I think a lot of shows grow organically really well if they can kind of really match that.
How do you keep data relevant with the same rinse and repeat meetings? How do you keep the data relevant with the same rinse and repeat meetings, so the same meetings that you're doing over and over again, year over year?
Not sure I understand that question. Can anyone clarify?
How do you keep it relevant with the same rinse and repeats, did you say?
Yeah.
Okay. I mean,
you're always getting the same data, then maybe you don't need to ask those questions, or maybe there's better questions.
But I mean, data needs to be current, obviously. So it's important we're looking to attain relevant information for the specific event in question. I think also it's important that we're always capturing it in like a structured and standardized way so we can make best use of it when we talk about AI and the dashboards as well, particularly when talking about polling, survey feedback. That's really important, is the standardization piece.
I think also, if you detect any trends in the data, that can be really powerful. They can seem like always the same data, but on the media side, we write, we have data, for example, from Cvent, or Cvent share some data with us, and it's kind of interesting because they won't share a lot of data, but they'll share enough that if we detect a trend, sometimes that's big news, because if you say, hey, this is happening more at events than it did 6 months ago, that can actually have huge impacts down the line. And sorry to mention a competitor, but it's just, just a source of data. When we get a source of data, sometimes we don't have a lot of, that data doesn't give us everything we need, but if it just shows a trend, that can actually be bigger news than, the actual numbers.
Yeah. All right, last question, unless any more pop in while we talk through this one, but some of our events are focused on brand awareness and relationship building. Do you have any advice or experience on measuring data for this, especially to convince C-suite of the impact?
Interesting. We were just talking about that earlier, actually. So, we run Skift. We have a few physical events. This bigger Skift event. Our main event is a 1,000-person event in New York. There's a lot of C-suite in the travel industry. So it's, and we have, the price for registration is $2,000-$3,000. So it's a good revenue stream for us. But it's really about media. It's really about how many times we get mentioned in the press. And it's kind of interesting because we're a media company. So it's like, do you need that? And it's like, yeah, because we're very niche. I run Skift meetings, so that's just events. And then there's Skift, which covers travel. But even within that, that's very, very niche, right? But when we have NBC or CNN or something saying, hey, at the Skift conference, this happened, or Skift says, this much % increase in travel spend is happening somewhere, that's huge.
Right.
Because that means that we are now in the eyes of CNN or CNN readers or New York Times or whatever it is, seen as the reliable source for this kind of information. So it's just an example, but we track those, of course. And every time we see one of those, our PR team is, sets a kind of dollar amount to those things, and it's huge, and it's all very hypothetical. But we are now a 100-person company. We are now able to charge people $3,000 for this event because we build our reputation. So I don't have a direct ROI to tell the C-suite every time we get mentioned on CNN it's worth this much. But it makes a massive difference because that brand awareness and that reputation you build is, it's priceless. You build the whole business around that. And I think that applies to whoever asked that question.
Rhys, do you have anything to add on that one?
I think Miguel covered that one.
Perfect. All right, I skipped over one last question. So how do you handle the data collecting and processing when you're already busy with organizing actual event logistics?
Automation, of course. I mean, this is, we should be getting out of a world where event planners are having to crunch through numbers and building new dashboards. You want to make sure you have an analytics platform that is set up, that is right for your business. So, this is part of why we have these platforms, is to free the event planners' times up to create efficiencies. And then when you combine AI on top of those dashboards, you're not even having to look for those correlations, insights the same way as you were before. They're being surfaced up to you by the AI. And as Miguel mentioned earlier, your platform should be answering questions you haven't even thought about, showing you trends you didn't even realize were there. So really the technology is there to free up the event planners, not to kind of hinder them more.
We want to give you time back in your days, right?
I think that makes a lot of sense. I think having resources, explaining the advantages that data brings you so that you get those resources. Because if the C-suite says, hey, with this data we can save money, we can make more money, they'll find the resources for you to get that data.
Exactly. Well, wonderful. Thank you all for attending the session here today, and thank you, gentlemen, for making the trip, and we appreciate it.
Thank you, Kira.